Thank you. It's nice to be here. We're going to start off our talk with a quiz. First, we'll start off with this sentence. Information proliferates at a rate far faster than we can assimilate it. How many of you would feel comfortable coming up here and diagramming this sentence for us? I don't see a hand. Okay, how about the next one? The distance required for an automobile to stop is directly proportional to the square of its velocity. If a car can stop in 1,600 meters from a velocity of 40 kilometers per hour, what will be the required stopping distance at 32 kilometers per hour? Answer? Well, surely the next one. What is the 26th Amendment to our Constitution? No answers. How do you convert the English measurement of 1 cup into the metric liter measurement? No hands. When I give this talk, and I will have as many as 500 in a room, and I ask these questions, and the room is attended by parents who feel confident that they can homeschool their children, I rarely get more than 2 or 3 hands raised per question. Now, how can they be confident in homeschooling their children if they can't answer these questions? Why is that? 2 reasons. Number 1, they know where to find the information when they need it, and number 2, they know they can relearn it if it's necessary. When I was in high school, I loved math. It was one of my favorite subjects. I made all A's. I did well in algebra, and I was actually looking forward to teaching my daughter algebra. And when she got old enough to learn that subject and we opened the book, it looked like a different language. I couldn't believe I had ever even done it. But I relearned it with her, and we got through the book, and we had a great time. Einstein says, why memorize facts? Why clutter my mind memorizing facts that are at my fingertips? Why indeed? Do you know that the single edition of the New York Times has more information, one single daily edition has more information than a 17th century Britisher would have encountered in his entire lifetime? More information. When we were moving to Tennessee, we had this tape given to us by a friend to listen to in the car, and on it there was a story called Zanzibar, and it was really cute, and this boy said, when I was in 6th grade, my teacher taught me everything there was to know about Zanzibar, a country in Africa. And I'm so glad she did, because every day after 6th grade, once a day and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, someone would stop and ask me a question about Zanzibar, and I could answer it. Of course, he was being sarcastic. The point he's making is he spent a lot of time learning information that wasn't necessary. It wasn't applicable to his life. He probably didn't retain it very long. Life is learning. From when you're born to when you die, it's continual, it never ends. We as homeschoolers need to seize the moment. As it was pointed out earlier, you already are your children's teachers. You've taught them how to tie their shoes, how to walk, how to talk, how to use manners. Homeschooling is just an extenuation of that, an extension of that process. That's all it is. Now, if you want to know what it is to have successfully educated your children, when your child has a desire to learn, when they have the tools and experience available to find the information they need, when they can find, verify, and use that information, then they've become an independent, lifelong learner. You've been successful with your education, because if there's some major scope and key skill or something you've left out, something that they just have to know, then they know where to find it. They can get to it. So they will be independent, lifelong learners. Now, when do you begin? Well, Einstein also says curiosity is more important than education. And that's when you begin with your children, is when they're curious. What is a 3-year-old's favorite word? Why? And you answer that question when they're 3 years old. You say, that's a great question. Let me tell you the answer. Unless they ask questions like my 2-year-old did this week. She held up the dish rag and said, what's his name? That's Rosie the Rag. But when they're 3 and they have questions, you say, that's a great question. Let me tell you the answer. And when they get a little bit older, you say, that's a great question. Let me show you how we find the answer. And you do that with them. And when they get old enough and they've had the experience, they have the tools, you say, that's a great question. Look it up and get back with me. Now, at that time, if your children are as smart as mine, and they're pretty smart, they say, Mom, why is? Never mind. Because they know I'm going to tell them to look it up. You need to be flexible as a homeschooler. You need to seize the moment. Take learning opportunities as they arrive. You know, so many times I have seen friends of mine have children who are just so curious and interested in something that's going on outside or in the news or just some event, and the parent is so insistent that they finish a certain number of work pages or get through a textbook that they're losing that opportunity. They're not seizing the moment. And as homeschoolers, you are so flexible, you can do that. If there's a PBS special on at 11 o'clock at night about sharks and your child is interested in sharks, you stay up and watch the special. Oh dear, you have to sleep late the next morning. It's horrible, but sometimes we get to do that. Life presents learning opportunities all the time. If you would take note of the questions your children ask, in fact, I challenge you for a week, just keep a notebook of questions they ask and find the answers together and write them down. My 10-year-old could ask enough questions that we could just spend all day, every day answering his. If they're not curious, there are some children who just never ask questions, then you start asking the questions for them. Give them ideas. Say things like, how does that red light know to be red on one side and green on the other side? And what would happen if it were green on both sides? Or do you know what would happen if the Earth was located just 5 miles closer to the sun? And here's one of my favorite questions. Did you know that above the equator, the water in the toilet swirls one way when it flushes, and it swirls the other when it flushes below the equator? Why is that? Now, if you ask enough questions, your children will become curious about things, and soon they will be the ones asking the questions. Now, what you want to expose them to is basic forms of reference. Almanacs. How many of you own an almanac? Almanacs are wonderful books. They're about this thick. They're not very expensive. The two most popular, I think, are the World Almanac and Information Please, which is not related to the books I have. I prefer the World Almanac. I just seem to find the information I need quicker. But you will find when you open those books, you need to rent the Hubble telescope to read them. The writing is so small, it's just unbelievable. I don't know why they don't make them a little bigger. But almanacs are great because you can keep up with current events as you purchase almanacs every year. Retail, they're $12, but I see them all the time at yard sales for 50 cents, quarter. You need to have an atlas, globe, and maps in your home. Again, these are not very expensive items. Walmart and Sam's always has a really good deal on atlases. Sam's currently has 2 large laminated maps of the United States and the world that are very affordable. Concordance. If you have younger children, you want a concise concordance which lists every word in the Bible and tells you where it's found. As they get older, you want an exhaustive concordance which includes the Greek and Hebrew dictionaries and the derivatives of the words. A good dictionary. At our house we have both an abridged and an unabridged. We show them the difference. The unabridged is this big and makes a great booster seat, and we use the abridged most of the time. Encyclopedias. Now, my favorite is the World Book. Next to that's the Britannica. Those tend to get quite expensive. I know Dave and Joan Exley, when they were younger and wanted a set, they sold 5 or 6 sets so they could earn theirs for free. That's an option. You can buy encyclopedias used too. The set I bought is not one of those brands because I couldn't afford it, but it was one I found at a garage sale for $35, yet I have the World Book on CD, so I can access information that way too. Facts Plus, there is a teacher in Alaska named Susan C. Anthony, yeah, not Susan B., Susan C., who was very frustrated with how hard it was for children to use almanacs and find information. So she rewrote the essential information in a book that she entitled Facts Plus. It's very easy to access the information. I have 1 copy at my desk because she's updating it, so it's currently out of print, but it will be back in a month or so. I'd love to show it to you. It's so easy to use. It has enough information about everything. You could almost homeschool from kindergarten to 12th grade with that one book. I use it a lot. When I need to find information, it's the first place I look, and it usually has what I need. We don't get the daily newspaper, but it's important that your children are aware of what the newspaper contains, that you give them an understanding of current events and just everything in a newspaper. Telephone directory, a lot of people do not think of the telephone directory as a form of reference, but it really is. Unless you live in a town like we just moved to where there's only 6,000 people and it's so little, we lose it all the time. But for big cities, particularly like Orlando, phone books have a bunch of information. And then Timetables of History. If you haven't seen that book, that is a wonderful book. It's like a timeline, but in book form, and it lists recorded history, so it starts around 5000 BC up to the 1900s, and it divides it into categories like art and science, and it has it in accordance to dates. But the really good thing about this book is in the back there's a cross-reference index. So if you know, you want to look up, say, Victor Hugo wrote Les Miserables and you don't know when, you can either look up Victor Hugo or the name of the book in the back, and then it will give you the date. So it's so easy to use. It's a great book. When I first came home with this book, it's this big. I was so excited. I said, look what is in this book. I showed my kids. I use it all the time. They never used it. Well, they did one time. They used it to weight down a tablecloth to make a tent on the table. But they weren't using it for forms of reference, and I would get very frustrated. You need a good thesaurus, too. I prefer Roget's. Roget's thesaurus comes out two ways, either alphabetically or with the numbers, where you look up the numbers and cross-reference. Everybody has their own they like. I prefer the alphabetical. But I bought all these reference books. My house was full of them. I used them all the time. I told my children all about them, but they were never using these books, and I was getting very frustrated that they wouldn't. So I thought, well, gee, I've got to come up with something. So I decided to come up with a worksheet of questions that were worded in such a way they had to use many forms of reference. So what I did, I came up with that. I gave them to the oldest two. They were competitive. I said, see who can finish this first. You start at the top, you start at the bottom. And all of a sudden they were running around the house pulling out all these reference books that they had not touched before. In fact, I saw one daughter with the Guinness Book of World Records. Well, that does have a lot of information, but I knew she didn't need it for this particular worksheet. And I said, what are you looking up? She says, I'm looking for 3 words that mean hurry. I said, well, you're not going to find it in there. And she closed the book and she says, oh, I thought this was the thesaurus because they're both red. So that's how often she had used it. But when they finished the worksheet, they had gotten their questions. They had a lot of fun. They used a lot of books. They had 2 of the questions. They had different answers. So we researched that question and found that both answers were acceptable. So it was a good learning experience. And that's what I started doing with my children, was providing them with worksheets with questions. Now with the smaller children, and this is what I suggest you do with grades K to 3, you start out by posing a question. How many people in this room have a violin in their home? None. Okay, so, well, 1. Okay. You have to get another question. If you don't own a violin, you can start with this question. You ask your child, how many strings are there on a violin? How would we find that out? What is your child going to suggest? He'll say, let's look at a violin. You'll say, great, we don't have one. So how do we find out how many strings are on a violin in our house? And you let them think about it and see if they come up with any suggestions. More than likely they won't, unless they know of somebody who owns one, and they'll suggest you call them. At this point, you explain to them what a dictionary is and what an encyclopedia is. And you say, you know, a dictionary tells you the meaning of words, and it might include violin, it might have a description, it might have an illustration. Encyclopedia gives you more information. Let's look it up in both and see. Now, when we did that at our house, both our encyclopedia and our dictionary contained pictures of violins that were clear enough to count the strings. So I had them count them, but we read the descriptions too. You want to introduce your child to every suggested form of reference that may contain the answer to the question, and explain to them how to use each one. You want to discuss further possibilities like games, music stores, and then you do want to discuss friends who own violins. I do teach my children that people are a form of reference. It's all right to ask an authority in a field. If you know they've played baseball for 10 years and your question has to do with baseball and you can't find the answer anywhere else, then go ahead and ask them. And that does several things for them. One is building the skill of being able to talk to and communicate with adults. My daughter one time had a question that said, how many cities are located in your county? And she asked me, where would I find that? And I said, well, look in the phone book. They have maps. Maybe you'll see that. She couldn't find it in the phone book. So she said, what should I do now? I said, well, call the Chamber of Commerce. Well, the first few times she had made phone calls to adults, she was very nervous, but she had done this enough that she did it. So she called the Chamber of Commerce. Now, let me tell you, at the time we were living in Tallahassee. Tallahassee is in Leon County. We have one city in one county. She called the Chamber of Commerce and said, I'm doing a research paper. My question is, how many cities are in our county? Can you tell me how many cities are in Leon County? This lady said, I don't know. Call the Department of Tourism. And gave her another phone number. She called the Department of Tourism. She said the same thing, and they said, I don't know, try this number. They gave her another state agency. She called the state agency, asked the same question, and they said, I think there's just one. Not one of those 3 adults offered to find the information, offered to get back with her, or even, and this was the Chamber of Commerce and the Department of Tourism. So she really, it was a good learning experience. She learned how experienced you have to be to work for the government. No. She did find the answer to her question eventually. After you've discussed further possibilities, it's good to keep a journal of questions your children ask and record the answers they find and record your site. You want them to become used to verifying their information. When I gave my children the worksheets, I would have guidelines. I would say you may not use a source more than twice. They couldn't ask a human being more than twice. They couldn't use a CD Encyclopedia, which has great search and find capabilities, more than twice. This is so they would get exposure to using many forms of reference. So I would limit how many sources they could find to 2, and I said you have to cite your source. And even if it's something you already know, prove it. Cite your source, because you want them to become confident in being able to verify the information they find. Don't wait until high school to teach research skills. If your children learn at a young age how to find information for themselves, it will improve their ability to learn and their enjoyment of it, because it is something that they will enjoy doing. They will have fun finding information, and it will be like a scavenger hunt for them. In fact, that's what we turned it into, was scavenger hunts for information. Most high schoolers are only familiar with using the encyclopedia, well, most college kids too, as a form of reference. And you also need to teach them the definition of the word plagiarize and tell them not to do that. My sister teaches at a university, and it's so funny when she grades these papers, because you can tell the people are writing in their own words, and it's sort of crude writing, but all of a sudden they have these great paragraphs in the middle, and they haven't cited any source, and you know they've just taken it directly from the encyclopedia. Also, don't let them become independent on the internet for doing research. My daughter's college will not even allow her to cite the internet as a source when she's researching. Why is that? Because anybody and their brother can set up a web page. I could set up one tomorrow and I could say 95% of Americans are left-handed. It's not true, but it's on the internet, and somebody could look up that web page and cite that as a source, but they haven't verified it or confirmed it, and it's not true. Now, the internet's a great way to find a lot of information, but you don't want your children to become so dependent on the computer that they don't know how to use the books and verify the information. Now, how many of you have heard of Jeff Myers or Summit Ministries? Understanding the Times, wonderful program, and they teach children how to be leaders. One of the things I heard on the tape several years ago has stayed with me, and I really like what Jeff Myers said. It's questions that you teach your children to ask so that they can defend their faith, they can defend their knowledge, whatever it is they're talking about. If they learn how to ask these questions, the number one question is, how do you know that to be true? If they're discussing something with someone and the other person comes up with a statement that they don't agree with, let them learn to ask, how do you know that to be true? I know one time Dave Barton was at the Law Library in Tallahassee, and he was talking about the Founding Fathers. Now, Dave Barton knows a lot about the Founding Fathers, and he owns like 40,000 of their works, and he's read most of them. And some man raised his hand and says, well, I heard such and such, something very derogatory about a Founding Father. And Dave Barton said, well, how do you know that to be true? And the man got very defensive, and he said, I don't want to argue with you. And Dave Barton said, no, no, not at all. He says, it's just something I've never heard before, and I'd like to know where you got your information. And the man finally admitted that he just heard someone say. It was just hearsay, and it wasn't based on anything. So if you teach your children to ask, how do you know that to be true? On what information do you base that? Where did you get your information? And what happens when you're wrong? Then as they get older and someone says something to them that they haven't thought about or been confronted with yet, they know it's in some disagreement with what they believe. If they've learned these questions, then when they're discussing things, they will be able to answer anyone who has information they haven't been presented with. When you're teaching your children about all the things in the newspaper, it's good if you explain to them what the editor is and what the letters to the editors are and how there are issues that you can write in about. And the particular Wednesday that we were studying the newspaper at the library, they had a question in there for readers to respond to. And the question was, do you think Floridians should be allowed to have license tags that have the words "Choose Life" on their tag? And they said, what do you think? Write in. So we discussed to our children about answering letters, writing letters to the editor and answering their questions, and we had them each write just one little line. These were little boys, and we sent it in, and they published that the next week. Now, after you have given your children the experience researching, the tools, they have the books, they know how to do it, this is the question that you need to teach them. I mean, not the question, the answer you need to teach them when people ask them a question with information that they don't know. Because there's always, I tell my children, there will always be people who know more than you about certain subjects. There will always be people who know less than you. When my daughters were competitive gymnasts, I said, you probably know more than 90% of the population about gymnastics, but you know less about other subjects. Your confidence should not be based on what you've memorized or what you've retained. It should be based on your ability to find it. So I've taught them to memorize this statement. When somebody asks them something that they don't know, they say, I haven't needed that information up until now, but I know how to look it up. Would you like me to find the answer and get back with you? And that way they have a confidence and they know that they can find that information and they're not made to feel ignorant for not knowing it. So that's one of the things that I strive to teach the children. So then you will have, if you've taught your children, give them the desire to learn, encourage that, give them the tools and the experience so they can find the information when they need it, teach them how to verify and use it, and that will come when they're older, not K to 3. Then they will be lifelong independent learners. Thank you.
Time seems to fly, oh, the years pass so quickly now, like sand through your fingers. You hold it once and then it's gone. The